We come now to the fourth and final part of our lecture on neurobiology. If you remember when we were talking about the neurotransmitters, we talked about how they have different circuits throughout the brain. We can go from the mesolimbic up into the mesocortical and all of that. So there are brain circuits throughout the brain. Now, we also use the term brain and mind interchangeably, but they are not. The brain is that 3.5 pound cauliflower shaped gelatinous mass that is located between our ears and from our nose to our scalp. But the mind, what's the mind? That's a much more difficult concept to grasp. Daniel Siegel, S-I-E-G-E-L, I believe is the way, or maybe it's S-E-I. I never get his spelling right. Daniel Siegel is an author with many books. His most recent is The Mind. He talks about the mind as an embodied. It is definitely within our body, but it is not just up in the head. The mind is embedded throughout the body in all of the nerves that come in through the peripheral system and also our perceptions. It is embodied. It is embedded in the sense, in relationships, in the sense that we really cannot develop independently or isolated from other human beings. We are embedded in relationships. And the mind is something that is constantly emerging and self-organizing, that regulates the flow of energy and information across time. That's a mouthful. We'll continue to explore that. So we have these brain circuits, various brain circuits throughout the brain, and they are developing in the infant in utero and in the newborn and throughout our life. So in this slide, if you look over there on the left, the top of the little graph says brain circuits. And if in early life there is nothing that bothers those little brain circuits, then they are unprovoked. And so unprovoked, lower below the line of brain circuit is symptoms. There are no symptoms. The child develops a healthy self-confidence, is functioning, no problems. But then we have what's called epigenetics, and those are experiences that happen over and above our genetic inheritance. And those epigenetics, those experiences, can actually change the way our genes respond or alter the expression of our genes. So child abuse is considered an epigenetic experience. And if there is repeatedly provoked and abusive activity in childhood or other traumatic events or toxic experience, toxins in the environment, any of those can put stress on those developing circuits. And you see that by the red circular arrows and looks like a disturbed cycle. And so if that happens, then repeated abuse in childhood leads to transient symptoms that we see as depression, anxiety, and many other issues. Now, if that abuse is stopped, then possibly that brain circuit can recover some of its normal equilibrium. And then as life goes on, if there is no further provocation, there are no symptoms showing up, but that early epigenetic influence has already caused a sensitization to stress. It is irreversible. And so as I grow, if I'm not under stress, then there may not be any symptoms. However, if I am put under further stress and I am vulnerable to it, then I may end up having problems. We need to follow this slide from top to bottom and from left to right. So at the top we have a brain, and we know that in that brain are all of these different circuits. If there is no stress in infancy, or depending upon the level of stress, no stress, mild stress, or child abuse, that will have different impact upon the developing circuits. Emotional trauma or physical child abuse or all of those can lead to compromised circuits, whether it be the dopamine transporter system or whether it be the acetylcholine system, all of those different systems, then going down, we can see that if there's normal stress in life, our systems are able to recover, even though they've been activated by stress. But if there has been that earlier sensitization going on, then I may either have reduced reactivity to stress and be able to recover, or if there are multiple adult life stressors added on to my already compromised early system, then it leads to major depression and other emotional problems that we see in our psychiatric mental health practice. Earlier in this series of neurobiology, we talked about the downstream cascade system, multiple signal transduction cascade systems, that the end result of that was, one of the end results, not the, one of the end results was the expression of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So we see here at the top of this slide a healthy little neuron with all of its branching dendrites at the top and its long axon at the bottom. If you follow down to the left, where if there is no brain-derived neurotropic factor being produced, the cell, as you can see, there's a little red circle around both a watering can and a knife. Brain-derived neurotropic factor is like a fertilizer to the nervous system. And so if there is no fertilizer, the cell is going to die. And that's the graphic there with the knife. It's, if so to speak, committing hara-kiri, but in neurological terms, that's called apoptosis. And there you see the dead neuron down there, and the knife has fallen out of its hand. However, over on the right-hand side, that watering can is sprinkling that wonderful bush of the neuron with some wonderful material called brain-derived neurotropic factor, and that leads to a much healthier, more robust neuronal system. The consequences of this are that stress affecting the circuits can affect then also this brain-derived neurotropic factor. This slide portrays what I just said at the end of the last slide. If stress is then affecting that long helical cord called gene and chromosomes, and so the brain-derived neurotropic factor gene is affected. The watering can does not sprinkle the nerve systems, and the nervous system then is either weak or very wilted or dies off. All right, let's start putting some of this together. We have all sorts of brain circuits, and if you follow around the outer side of the circle here, and again, if you're following this in a PowerPoint slideshow presentation, keep clicking through. But starting over on the left top, we have the mesolimbic area. Going over to the top right, we have the mesocortical prefrontal, the nucleus accumbens and reward circuits in the striatal area. Going down to the far right, the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. Going down to the bottom of the circle is the amygdala and the orbital frontal cortex. Going over to the left is the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And so let's talk about possibly schizophrenia. Schizophrenia has positive symptoms, and that means something that is added on to my personality and behavior that should not be there. So the hallucinations, the delusions, the very aggressive behavior. And schizophrenia also has negative symptoms, and that means that something that should be there is not. And so we have cognitive blunting, flat affect. And that that comes from the mesocortical and the nucleus accumbens area, where the positive symptoms come from the amygdala, hippocampus, mesolimbic area. Now, these cognitive symptoms, not only are they blunted, but for many people with schizophrenia, their thoughts are very disjointed, very fragmented, lots of problems, and that also comes from the dorsal prefrontal area. Now, the aggressive symptoms of the paranoia and the suspicions and the anger and the hostility that are part of schizophrenia, those are coming and arising primarily from circuits in the amygdala and the orbitofrontal area. And then people with schizophrenia, they have a disruption in their affective life, sometimes a very flat affect, not showing much emotion, other times explosive affect, and that's all associated with circuits in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. You saw this slide earlier. I bring it up again because I want to reinforce the fact that if there are compromises in these brain circuits, it can have an impact on the expression of our emotions. We can have a reduced positive affect if there is a problem with the transporter genes of serotonin transporter, reuptake transporters, or there can be an increase in our depressed mood and hostilities if there is a decrease in the presence of the norepinephrine and serotonin. By now, if you have been following this lecture, and also if you've been playing around at the brain at McGill, you should be able to identify the different parts of the brain on this slide. Down at the bottom right with the flowery circle is the cerebellum, and then is the spinal column. The circle in the middle of the brain is the thalamus. The oval to the left of that circle contains the striatum and the nucleus accumbens. And if you go over to the far left, the frontal area of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, and go down and sort of to the right, you come to the amygdala and the hippocampus. And if you go up from the amygdala, in dead center lower area is the hypothalamus. Now, all of those areas are brain circuits because they intercommunicate with each other. And in depression, these areas can be affected and have one type of manifestation, or if we go to mania, which we'll see in the next slide, we can have the opposite. So in depression, there is an interruption of sleep and appetite, and that is controlled primarily by the hypothalamus. We also have guilt and suicidality and worthlessness and sad mood and lack of interest, and that is primarily from the amygdala as a circuit with other areas of the brain. If you go over to the left to the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, remember, if you fold your fingers over your thumb and then lift them up slightly, it would be there at the base of your fingers. That patty, fleshy area there, so to speak, would be the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And because that is connected and touching into the limbic area, that area is also associated with guilt, suicidality, worthlessness, and mood. Now, a large part of depression can either be a slowing down, a feeling of mental fatigue, and that's the prefrontal cortex. Also a decreased ability in concentration, a lack of interest and pleasure, that is also the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. There is a decrease in pleasure and interests and a feeling of mental fatigue, that's also associated with the nucleus accumbens. But remember, all of these are circuits intercommunicating with one another. And then there is also physical fatigue that comes along with depression, and that is from two areas. It is from the striatum, and it is also from the cerebellum and spinal column. In this slide, the same areas of the brain are present, but now there is going to be a different type of response because of the way these brain circuits are being stimulated or not stimulated by the presence of neurotransmitters, which are the first messengers starting a whole downstream cascade. So in the hypothalamus and thalamus, in mania, there is a much pronounced decreased need for sleep. In the Mania, there is a very high, grandiose sense of mood, and that comes from both the amygdala, and if you go over into the ventral medial prefrontal cortex down there at the left lower area of the brain, also taking risks, and my speech is very pressured and fast, and my thoughts are racing. Those racing thoughts are also part of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And the racing thoughts and highly goal-directed activity come from an association with the nucleus accumbens. I am highly agitated, very jittery, very on the move, and that is also from the striatum. And then again, that decreased need for sleep and a heightened arousal is partly through the thalamus. So you can see that these brain circuits are extremely important in terms of the pathways of nerves and the connections that they make. Remember, with 100 billion neurons, each having about 10,000 potential connections, the possibility for things is astronomical. And then remember that in the neuronal development, neurogenesis in the womb, how many things can go wrong in either the synaptic structure or the neurotransmitter transport systems or in the enzyme formation that degrades enzyme. So many things can go wrong. The amazing thing is that so many of us, at least on the surface, look so normal and sane. We have now looked at the brain very briefly from an anatomical, an electrical, and a chemical viewpoint, and that describes the brain. But there is also this thing called the mind. And let's move out of the brain for a moment and into the mind. We're moving beyond the analytical way of looking at the brain and dividing it into 1, 2, 3, 4 dimensions and all the different neurons and their formation and dendrites and axons and synapses. And we're moving beyond the chemical analysis of neurotransmitters. We're moving more into the area of, I don't know any other word, mystical, and the mystery of our consciousness and the wonder of our own self-awareness and the ability to be aware of another. What is the mind? And as I said, Daniel Siegel describes it as an embodied and embedded relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information across time. The mind is an emergent reality, and it is a self-regulating reality. We'll look at a number of factors of this now and in our first lecture in MSN 634. Actually, our second. Here are 3 of the many books written by Dan Siegel, S-I-E-G-E-L, finally got the spelling correct, and he is the guru of modern interpersonal neurobiology. What a fascinating field. The 90s was called the decade of the brain, and he was absolutely one of the prime movers in that. His most recent book, The Mind, or just Mind, seems to be a summary and a really good, more final articulation of his understanding and presence in the neurobiological world. On the far right there is the book The Whole Brain Child. He has also been extremely influential in the understanding of development of the brain and the development of the mind as a child grows. I love that little book in the center, The Interpersonal Neurobiology. He came to a seminar lecture one time and he was wearing these big cargo pants that had these huge big pockets in the leg area. And this book, The Pocket Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology, had just come out. He said that it really is not a pocket guide. However, he was able to slip it into the big pocket of his cargo pants, and that's why he was able to call it a pocket guide. But we have in that area of the brain called the cortex, there are only 6 layers of cells. So it's like playing with 6 cards from a deck of cards piled one above the other. And in those 6 layers, you start from top to bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The bottom layers, 6, 5, and 4, are much more of our intuition coming up from our feelings and our emotions. It is in many ways pre-verbal, and those sensations coming up from levels 5, 4, 6, 5, and 4 trigger thought processes, and those thought processes, as we develop, we learn language, we learn words and symbols for our experiences and our emotions. So we can have then thoughts and processes that trigger word symbols that then we can express ourselves, and that even the expression of our feelings and thoughts can trigger further feelings and emotions and affect. And so this flow of energy and information going through those 6 levels of our brain is our mind. And that information is not just through those 6 levels of the brain, but it is also coming to us from our environment, from our hearing, our smells, our tastes. It is coming through our touch. It is then coming through our sense of the other in our interpersonal relationships, and even in the mystery of our ability to be aware that there is something more than just this that we're standing in right now. And that is the mystery of the other, the divine, the higher power, God. Buddhists have a phrase for the mind. They call it monkey mind, the mind that is just jumping all over the place, that can go from limb to limb, from ground to tree and back again, up and down and all around. Well, that's how our mind interconnects and jumps all over the place in nanoseconds. And so I love this slide because it's called the mind map, trying to track where that mind of mine is going in any one given moment. So each of us has our own mind, and we definitely even have that phrase in our language. Boy, she sure has a mind of her own, to sometimes talk about somebody who is rather stubborn and resistive to ideas. But we don't just have a mind of our own. We have a mind among us. To be of one mind, or possibly to be of one heart. This is what is absolutely astounding, is that the impact of relationships on the brain, the development of neurons, and the ability to self-regulate are all part of interpersonal neurobiology. A few slides back, we were looking at the impact of trauma on the development of the brain and how it can compromise those brain circuits. And then the ability to self-regulate. If I do not have a trusting relationship in my life as a child that can help me look at when something frightening is happening, how do you respond to it? One of the most wonderful ways of parenting I ever have seen was there was a 3 or 4-year-old child who had been quite frightened by something, and that child was screaming and terrified and sobbing. And the young father came up, and I love this, he knelt down in front of his child. And he didn't scold the child, he reflected the child. He said, "Oh, look, you are very frightened by that. This has you very scared. You are trembling and you are crying." And he was looking directly into the child. And then he took and he put his hand on the child's chest, and he said, "Oh, I can feel how fast your heart is beating. Oh, you must be very, very frightened." And then he said, "But wait a minute." And he took the child's hand, and he put the child's hand on the child's chest, and then took the other hand of the child and put it on his own, the father's chest, and said, "Do you feel how my heart is beating? Can you feel how slow my heart is beating? That's because right now I am not afraid. I am worried for you, but I am not afraid. Now what do we need to do to help your heart beat more slowly like my heart?" That is self-regulation. And can you imagine the impact of that type of relationship on the developing sense of self and an increasing awareness of the other and our evolving sense of self in the world? There was a story of a new teacher assigned in Louisiana to a room of African American students, and she got their first papers back, third or fourth graders in math, and one of them out of 20 questions had gotten 2 right, and the teacher put +2, big +2, and handed it back to the child, and the child was ecstatic. Hot diggity, I know I can grow, I got 2 right. That means there's 18 more I can learn. Where if you give me a -18, it just sucks the life out of you. Another story of a teacher who asked the children to color and draw, and everybody was coloring and drawing except one child who apparently had had a rather traumatic life already and just sat there. And the teacher came up and looked at that blank piece of white paper and then leaned over and whispered in the child's ear, "That is the best picture of a snowfall I have ever seen." So all of this shows that the power of our interpersonal relationships helps develop within us a sense of belonging and a sense of mattering, or it can hinder that and stunt our growth, both as persons and in relationships. Our mind is constantly seeking to make sense of our life. It is evolving and it is self-organizing. It is constantly trying to make meaning of whatever is happening in our life. Our active mind always wants an answer. It can abhor ambiguity and vacuums, and that's why when something so traumatic and disturbing such as a death happens, our minds are just constantly active and running, trying to figure out why. That is what the mind does. Spend a few moments enjoying this slide, this graphic. I don't think it can say it any better. A picture is worth 1,000 words. This is how relationships form our brain, and our brain is truly the relationships that have shaped our mind. Some of this goes back to Psychology 101 that many of us studied in our early nursing careers, and yet this understanding of attachment in the mind remains so advanced and mysterious that postdoctoral fellows can still stand absolutely mute. John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, as you may remember, were the great investigators who studied relationships between caregivers and infants. The secure relationship is the mom and the baby are playing happily in the room. The mama leaves the room, the baby cries and wants her back, and when she returns, the baby goes to mama for soothing. She does, and things are good. In an insecure or ambivalent relationship, mommy and baby may or may not be playing together in the room, and then mommy leaves the room, and baby just sits there looking bored or not disturbed. And when mommy returns, baby may or may not return to mommy, may just continue playing. That is insecure or ambivalent. And chaotic or disorganized is mommy and baby may or may not be playing together in the room. And when mommy leaves the room, baby can look relieved. And when mommy returns, baby can scream. Now, the picture here of the little boy standing next to his father takes me back to the story I told you a moment ago about the father and son. The qualities of interpersonal relationships become embodied in our brain. They literally impact the way the neurons develop and connect. And the qualities of interpersonal relationships are embedded in our mind in terms of how we look on the other and the world with either trust or distrust. I may be wandering a little far afield of neurobiology, but what we have just been talking about, this interpersonal neurobiology, has such implications for our mental health in terms of the early relationships developing within us either the capacity to trust or destroying, severely impairing that ability to trust. The impact of early experiences, and then in the sense of feeling safe in this world or feeling threatened in this world. And there is this tremendous human characteristic and quality that is truly a mystery. Why is it that some people can go through an experience of trauma and seem to develop just fine, where others go through the experience of trauma and they fall to pieces? That quality of being able to be resilient or bounce back is called resiliency. One of my images of that is a rubber band. If you take a rubber band and stretch and stretch and stretch it, and then you let it go, it comes back to its original size and shape. It is resilient. But if you stretch it too much, it loses the ability to bounce back. And so all of this influences our senses of ongoing well-being, and we have personality styles. Now I'm moving beyond talking about the early child caregiver relationship descriptors of secure, ambivalent, avoidant, and chaotic, and I'm talking about my own personality style, your personality style, whether I am secure in myself and in my place in this world, or whether I'm very ambivalent about myself and feel insecure in this world, or whether I am very tight and rigid within myself and I avoid relationships, I'm resistant to intimacy and closeness, or whether my personality is just chaotic. And some of this chaotic personality is what we now in mental health will call borderline personality disorder. The most devastating sociopath person has these biological and neurological differences right within their brain. From studies have been shown. However, the precipitating factor of the activation of that sociopathy seems to be childhood trauma. So the most devastating and destructive of any childhood trauma is that of active neglect. This little Peanuts cartoon is a helpful and fun way to look at the different attachment styles that we have as adult people toward others. So high proximity seeking, I want to be around others, I enjoy being around others, or low proximity seeking, leave me alone, I withdraw, and then high anxiety of abandonment or low anxiety for abandonment. Determines whether we are secure, preoccupied, fearful, or dismissing. In our second class in 634, I'm going to be talking briefly about what is mental health, and again I will be drawing upon Dan Siegel. But as we wind up our discussion on neurobiology and interpersonal neurobiology, Siegel also talks about personalities. They can be classified as rigid or as integrative and flexible or as chaotic. And the image there of a river flowing, that is a flexible, flowing, fluid personality style. Or on one bank, you can have way too rigid a personality style, and on the other bank, it is way too chaotic a personality style that does not have boundary, neither in self nor in the other, whereas the rigid is so closed in and cannot adapt. The best way to describe a healthy interpersonal neurobiology is if I am flexible, adaptable, have a coherent sense of myself, I am energized, and I am stable. FACES, the FACES theory of mental health: flexible, adaptable, coherent, energized, and stable. So in mental health, we need to ask, what helps promote mental health? And we'll be looking at that. And what hinders mental health? That's what we will be looking at throughout our entire upcoming 3 semesters. And as mental health providers, what's our role in seeking to facilitate, to encourage, to support interpersonal neurobiology? I put this slide together last year after reading the book Mindful Compassion, How the Science of Compassion Can Help You Understand Your Emotions, Live in the Present, and Connect Deeply with Others. The title is almost as long as the book. It is by Gilbert and Choden, 2014. They talk about the old brain and the new brain, and this is what we've been talking about as well. The limbic area would be considered part of the old brain or the lizard brain, so to speak, and the new brain is that upper cortical area, especially the prefrontal cortexes. So from the old brain, which is also the ventral medial prefrontal cortex area, come our emotions of fear, anger, anxiety, lust, and joy, and our social motives to be close to each other, to belong, our desire for sex, and our seeking of status. All of those come out of so-called old brain. They are really more intuitive. They are from the gut. They are things from that we sense, whereas the new brain, the upper, more recently, millions of years developed part of our brain that makes us so-called humans, is the ability to imagine, to plan, to anticipate, to reflect, to have purposeful focusing of mind, and that ability to integrate different experiences by remaining flexible and open and coherent and energized and stable. That's what gives us our self-identity. Now, we can be, to go back to Siegel's concepts of rigid and chaotic, on the right-hand side, if we are living too much in just the logic, we can be very, very rigid. We do not take emotions into account. And unfortunately, that's what medicine did for many, many years. Or if you look over on the left-hand side, the emotional mind, if we are just responding out of emotions, it can be very chaotic. So there is rigid and emotional mind. But if we can integrate those, if we can take the best of what is logical and color it with that which is emotional, we come to wise mind. I'm also currently listening to a book, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, where he talks about how our moral reasoning is really much more intuitively driven. We just get this sense. And then our mind starts to look for justifications. Our logical mind or brain starts to look for justifications for that felt intuitive sense. And he uses the wonderful metaphor of our our emotional brain is more like an elephant, and our logical brain is more like the rider on the elephant. That once the elephant decides where it's going to go, the rider may have only just a minor influence. And the whole purpose of mental health is to integrate both our emotions and our mind to get the elephant and the rider working together and moving purposefully in a healthy direction. In this slide, I purposely turned the graphic of the head upside down so that you're looking from now what seems to be top to bottom. The old brain is more that we share with all the animal kingdom. The old brain is actually more, so to speak, where our medications are going to work. They're going to calm down the amygdala. They are going to enhance the memory. They are going to also work on the cortex in terms of focus and attention. The new brain is the human part of us with the imagination and planning and purposeful direction, and that's where therapy enters in. But we don't want to kind of create an either or type of dichotomy that only therapy is what people need or only medications is what we should be doing. That may be way too simplistic. That maybe the wise brain is where we realize that we human beings with our amazing and awful brains are evolving, and that we need both therapy and medications. I constantly tell people, and you'll hear me saying this in other classes, pills do not teach skills. And as I give you the next lecture on overview of psychopharmacology, you'll see that I say to my clients, pills are like training wheels on a bicycle. They are not meant to be motors that get you up mountains of problems. They are only meant to give you some balance like training wheels as you learn to ride the bicycle. So I firmly believe that we need both therapy and meds in order to achieve a more rounded, full mental health. Daniel Siegel came up with this metaphor for a healthy mind. It's like servings on a plate, that we need sleep time, we need physical activity time, we need time, quiet, meditative time in order to focus. We need time with friends and family to enjoy. We need downtime just to relax. We need playtime, and we need connecting time to be with others, following from the top left and going counterclockwise. Now, I have simplified this with the acronym of SEAN, SEAN, and I keep encouraging you and everyone with whom I work to follow SEAN. Get enough sleep, and we'll be talking about that so often in the program. Get enough exercise. Mild exercise to moderate exercise has been proven to be as effective as antidepressants. Activity, A of SEAN, activity. That includes hobbies, it includes work, it includes spirituality, religion, it includes so many things, but activities that are healthy and wholesome and enriching. And then N, nutrition. In our first full class or second full class in 634, I will be talking much more about the importance of good nutrition. We have that enteric brain that I mentioned earlier, that authors such as David Perlmutter and Mark Hyman talk about good nutrition. The book Upward Spiral by Alex Korb goes much more in depth into holistic ways of coming up out of the downward spiral of depression, and that upward spiral is just these very things: sleep, exercise, activity, and nutrition. All right, this ends our introduction to neurobiology, and the next whole series of lecture pieces will be on the topic of Introduction to Psychopharmacology, a peek at all those pills.